Hello, Iggy Monda. How are you doing?
I'm good, man. How you doing, G?
I'm doing good. I interviewed you a few months ago or so when episode one of your series, Roughhousing, was released. Now all episodes obviously are available for people to listen wherever they get their podcast. And I've heard all the episodes, and I'm happy to have you come back on here for a follow-up interview. Now, obviously, you are the producer, reporter, and podcast host of Roughhousing, a six-part series exploring the culture of hazing in youth athletic programs around America. First question I have for you, Iggy, is it's a six-part series, and you explore this big topic of hazing in youth sports from various angles, social, cultural angles, perspectives, and experiences, and where they intersect, be it gender, sexuality, race, class. Every episode or every part of the series has a lot to offer, and you provide the context. My question for you is, if you were to produce an additional episode, let's say a part seven, what would you cover, and why? What else would you focus on?
First, I want to say thanks for bringing me back. I had a great conversation the first time. We have thought about this question a lot. I won't lie to you. We've thought about bonus episodes a lot. I won't lie to you. There'd probably be two different things that I would add as either a part seven or a bonus episode, if we had the resources or the time. One is, and we got into this a little bit, and other people might not, if they've listened to this series, if they listen to the Roughhousing series, they might think we've already covered this, but I wanted to do a whole episode just on one idea or one theme, which was masculinity. I wanted to, sorry, someone's calling me right now. I'll call her back. One theme I really wanted to do, me and my producer, Nina Ernest, really wanted to do was we wanted to dive in fully into this idea of masculinity. So there was an idea for an episode where the first act, so let's say there's a three acts in every episode. The first act would be something along the lines of the difference between masculine or hazing with men or boys versus hazing between girls or women. We also wanted to go into if there was any hazing with like non-binary or LGBTQ, but we couldn't find as much in terms of like research or studies or very much in there. So we didn't want to like poke that bear without actually really knowing like just the research or the evidence. But we definitely know it exists in that realm. But we wanted to first have the first act be masculine, male hazing versus female hazing, and the second act be sexual hazing, which would be like the Jordan Prevey story, the Tracy Stopford story, because a lot of cases, especially let's say within the last decade, but it goes before that too, a lot of the cases are starting to become or starting to look like it's sexual hazing. Right. The question is that a trend? Is that new? Or is that just something we're just starting to see more because more people are victims are less stigmatized and they're going to the police more, or they're complaining to their schools more, they're talking to their parents more about it. And then the third act would have been specifically about how does, in terms of the male gaze, how do we define our masculinity in relation to violence? How do we link violence with masculinity? And that could be whether it's growing up as a minority, growing up as just middle-class American, growing up wherever it is. Ricky Jones, who you heard mostly in episode 6, the final episode, but comes sporadically throughout the whole series. His whole book, Black Haze, great book, great guy if you want to talk to him. His whole study wasn't about hazing in Black Black fraternities. It was mostly about how does he link violence within the Black identity, within American history, within hazing. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to do a whole episode just on this idea of what does it mean to be a male in America, and why can we find that idea and that element within hazing in America as well, specifically in high schools, obviously, because that's what we focused on in Roughhousing. And obviously with Rodney's story and everything, and within my own story. I told you this in the last series, or sorry, the last interview, that I was in a fight club when I was a kid in 7th and 8th grade. And for me, it was just a part of growing up. I used to have fights with my cousins, just not because we were angry at each other, but just because we wanted to, whether to release some of the violent tendencies or whatever. But it's just this question of why do we have, whether it's violent tendencies, or why do we connect that violence with what makes us male? Is it something that's like, oh, we have to be violent to show that we're tough? if we're not violent, if we're soft, if we're weak, does that make us more quote unquote feminine or whatever the case is? So there is that question very much so within the world of hazing that I wanted to go into just a whole episode about masculinity. And the other thing that I would have loved to go into was there was one specific case that me and my producer looked into a lot, and my senior producer, Jessica Popovac, helped me with some of the interviews, was this one school, Modern Day High School, which I'm not sure if I told you about in the first interview, but Modern Day High School, for years, #1 football program in the country, one of the best athletic high schools in the country. They have a Hall of Fame, basically, coach, Bruce Rowlandson, who actually I'm pretty sure Congress just honored not too long ago. They're the only high school in the country to have 3 Heisman winners come out of it, which is Bryce Young, who's just the first overall pick in the NFL draft not too long ago, Matt Leinart, and I forgot who the third guy was a while ago. They have a history of hazing within the athletic program, specifically in the football program. We found cases of hazing in the water polo program, and not even just hazing. There's like sexual assault cases there within the athletic program. There's rumors of coaches dating athletes. There's a lot of stuff that's going on within the modern day program that we really, really wanted to go into. The problem was it was a lot to try to put into certain episodes with like larger themes. And the whole idea that it's not a public school, it was a Catholic school. And we wanted, if we're going to go into a Catholic school, because of the Catholic school playbook or the Catholic diocese playbook, they play by this very same playbook that you would see in, for example, the spotlight cases in Boston with the Catholic Church, if you know what I mean. They try to hide it under the rug for a lot of the time. Like when the lawsuit came out, when the police started investigating, I don't think they talked to the police for at least a month. The school and the diocese just completely closed the door. Like, no, we're not going to talk to you. They tried to throw it under the rug. The athletic director they hired, just a few months before, like not too long, not even like a year before the case happened, they essentially tried to ignore everything she said. And she moved all the way to Georgia from California. The president that they hired not too long ago, he went back to South Bend, Indiana, because he was trying to investigate it. It was basically everyone was protecting the image of modern day, the image of the Catholic diocese, the image of this amazingly winning and productive and just prospect producing program. And also Bruce Rowlandson is not only the coach of an incredibly productive football program, not only the coach of so many championships in the CIF, but also a guy that brought in the most money for the school. So there was just so much we wanted to go into, whether it's like the Catholic school playbook or the Catholic diocese playbook versus all the cases that happened there. It wasn't just one, it wasn't just 2 hazing cases that happened there. And it wasn't just hazing, like I told you before. And in the end, we just couldn't find a way that everyone agreed on how to do it properly. Like there was ideas of putting Bruce Rowlandson within the coaches episode in the 3rd episode where we went into Fred Riley. Mm-hmm. And there was ideas of putting them into an institution episode where we just talk about how institutions respond, which ended up turning into the Sabrina Oshkar Winkles episode in the 4th one about how the community, instead of the institution, the community responds. Right. Because the reason for me was, if we're going to do an episode just about how institutions respond, one, it's going to sound very similar to how people respond as well as how coaches respond. Because, for example, Bruce Rowlandson is not just a coach, he's also the institution. Again, he brings the most money there. Mm-hmm. I think he was on the donations page for modern day. And yeah, we just couldn't agree on how to put this into the thing. So if we ever did a bonus episode, if we ever even did outside of audio, if they wanted to do like a video series or whatever, modern day would have been like the choice. Because #1 football program in the country has a long history of hazing. Videos that I have seen that lawyers are not allowed to show anybody, or we're trying to like not have anyone see. Wow. And there's a lot to dig into there. So it was one of those cases where it's like the journalists. So there's this thing that I forgot who told me this, but as a journalist, you probably use only 10 to 20% of what you get. There's a lot of stories, a lot of information, a lot of research that we could get into, but you have to leave it on the cutting board at some point. And that was one of those darlings that we had to kill that I really didn't want to, and the team didn't want to, but it was just couldn't fit it in there, basically. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, for sure. How hard was it to let it go? Because when you speak of this, you're only using 10 to 20 or 10 to 20%. How hard was it to just let that go? Because just hearing uh how you're telling this story right there, I could see, I think anyone listening or hearing this could see, wow, this is another series potentially.
I was still reporting on it. Like it wasn't like something that I completely, for example, with modern day and masculinity, those two, there's other themes too, but those two things specifically, it wasn't like I wasn't reporting on those themes or those ideas or those schools. It was just every time I reported on it or got more interviews or found some more research or read old articles of, charges that got mysteriously dropped. Um,
Wow.
we were just trying to find ways to like put it in there. It was tough. It was very tough. It wasn't something again, it's not something I wanted to do. And again, we talked about bonus episodes. I wanted to put this somewhere. I wanted to put this somewhere. It's just in the end. And luckily, at least with the masculinity thing, because modern day, we couldn't get in there at all. And which was very unfortunate. They actually got into, it looks like one of the families got into a settlement. I can't release the names, but it looks like they settled. And I haven't heard from them in a while, but I hope they're doing okay. Um, at least with the masculinity episode, there was interviews that I did, even though we decided that we weren't necessarily going to do an episode specifically on masculinity. There was interviews that I did, like Eric Anderson, the professor in the University of Winchester, who did a whole study about hazing and masculinity within like two was it a college team? I think it was, I don't remember the
Cross
exact
country,
team.
I think it was cross country.
He used to be a cross country and track coach in high school in California, but
Right.
he looked at the two different British teams in the UK, and I don't remember. It was like rugby and polo or something like that. It was something along those lines. But I still talk to him because he had a very specific study that went into like masculinity and hazing. Right. I still talk to Ricky Jones to talk about hazing and masculinity. I still talk to Tracy Stopford, and to try to get into that scope. And though we changed the main theme of that episode, I still tried to put those elements of masculinity. So that one I couldn't really let go of as well as modern day. Right. But because I definitely was trying to put elements in there, even if we couldn't do it like a full episode. Modern day hurt because it's such a great story. Mm-hmm. But that one I could accept more just because I'm like, I don't know where the total running time would have gone with it. And we didn't have the financial resources to make another episode. So it's just, that one was just like, I had to bite that bullet. Masculinity, I was fighting like tooth and nail to have like some elements and variables into some of the episodes.
No, I mean, it's an important one. And I believe you added it in episode 5, the masculinity one, and it was really added to it overall. Actually, we're going to get into that later on. Curious to know what sort of, can you share any feedback you've received from listeners and those affected by the series? Have people reached out with any feedback, be it listeners like myself and people affected by the story?
I haven't gotten any negative feedback, which was one thing I did expect to get. Honestly, it's like no one has come out to me and be like, oh, how like hazing's not all bad. I expected to get like that crowd of people to be like, oh, not everyone who hazes is a bad person. Not like even the people that one group of people I expected to possibly say that were the people that used to be in my frat, for example. And I see some of them still, and no one has said anything bad to me. I've received like just honestly heartfelt like feedback. It was nice to see people said that it was just, I don't know, told well, and it was a story that needed to be told, and it was good to see. And then within the people that I actually talked to, like for example, the Eileen Stevens of the world. Eileen lives in Long Island, still lives in the same town. And I called her. I was trying to like make sure like she heard the episode. I wanted her to feel comfortable. She was very worried how she was going to come off. And she gave me a call right after hearing it. And it's like, she was like blown away, she said. And she was so happy with how it came out. The Kims were very happy with how it came out. It honestly was just all positive feedback. I was very happy I was surprised, honestly. I expected someone to be upset with me, whether even the victims, whether it's like I didn't go far enough or I didn't like talk, because I didn't go I could have made this a true crime about one story. I could have just been in Alabama following the Kims and the Kims only and throughout their case, which was an idea that we had originally. I could have gone a modern day and just did a modern day case, and that's it. We eventually tried to make this a larger scope story. So there are true crime elements in it. Like the first episode is very quote unquote true crime meets voyeuristic. You're put into a situation of hazing. You're put into one incident of hazing, but then we try to ask like the bigger questions. And I think that was what made me scared that people were going to be like, oh, you didn't go further into this story. Why didn't you look deeper into the Kim story? Why didn't you look deeper into Mobile, Alabama? Why didn't you look deeper into Santa Ana, California, and like their athletic complex? Like, but I didn't get that. People were just happy to see that there was this large element in this conversation starter. Basically, I think that was the biggest thing, was that that conversation did get started and people started looking at it in a different way. I have friends. I have like, just even like, this is not going to be an example of the whole community of listeners or audience members, but I have friends that usually don't read or listen to my stuff because you don't always read your friends or friends stuff, but that aren't fans of sports, and they are sharing it with their parents. Like I have a friend of mine who shared it with her mom, who might be an attorney, and she's trying to like work on this right now. I have a friend who mom is like a teacher that deals with like bullies and hazing all the time, and she's trying to do something about it now. And I don't know, that for me, I just feel fortunate to be able to share the story more than anything. So I'm just glad that it helps. Like Tracy Stopford, for example, the mother of Jordan Prevey in episode 5, she has been like, and all the moms, Eileen Stevens, Tracy Stopford, Mary Kim, like they are fighters. Thaisa Oshkar Winkles, I don't want to forget her. They're just literal fighters. They're trying to like push this story and push this idea of hazing and what is acceptable and what is crossing the line. And whether it's legally or whether it's just consciously or whether it's just literally just conversations with me or others. So they were very happy with the story. And they, like Tracy, for example, she's been trying to work with, I forgot what the group is called, but it was like in a Vermont Hazing Alliance that right before, like a couple of weeks before our episode came out with her, they were like, oh, we're going to shut this meeting down about hazing because it doesn't seem like we're able to do anything. It was one of the another example of like quote unquote failure in addressing hazing. And she's like, no, I got to talk to them. I'm going to reach out to them. I'm going to do everything I can for them. And she thought this podcast was helping her do that in the end. And I told her I'd be happy to help any way I can. So it seemed like it helped. And I think that's what the main thing in the end that I wanted it to do. I'm not an advocate. I'm not what's the word I'm looking for? I'm not someone that's like doing community service. I'm a journalist. I'm just trying to tell a story. Right. But and I'm glad it did help.
It's you know what? It's I think for any listener, I'll speak for myself, it's very eye-opening because you hear all these stories and you just can't believe what's happening to these children, because these are children. These victims are 14, 15. They're traumatized and they're experiencing this, and then you see the fallout, and you paint that entire picture. Someone who's a victim of hazing, who becomes a perpetrator of hazing. We get to see all these different perspectives. And I just have a few follow-ups in regards to what you said. You opened up you cover these stories, but it's not one story. It's about 4 stories, right? And 4 or 5, isn't it?
It's the Kims, the Oshkar Winkles, the Stopford Preevies, and Eileen Stevens. And Bob Meeker at the end. So like 4 to 5.
Yeah, and the question, and you've answered it just as you were speaking before. You decided to have these different experiences, right? You're telling multiple stories at once. Why was that? What is the value of that approach as opposed to zoning in on, say, one story? For the listener, how does that benefit us?
The number one thing I wanted to address was the show shed light on a phenomenon that we didn't know was happening, and to show how prevalent it was. I shared with you weeks ago the database that I had to create, because there's this one guy named Hank Newer. He's an historian of hazing. He was in a frat, and he is someone that's been trying to fight against hazing for years, way longer than like anybody else has. Or that might not be true, but like he's like the guy you think of when you think of like anti-hazing, at least from what I found. And he has his own like website with like a ton of cases, like more cases than I have, but he deals with every type of hazing case, whether it's like high school, whether it's high school sports, whether it's college, whether it's fraternities, sororities, Greek life. Um, no one has made anything specialized as in high school sports programs. So even Hank didn't have nearly as many cases as I had because he wasn't looking into that. And because they're juveniles, because they're underage, a lot of their cases are either not going to be shown in court. A lot of their names are not going to be shown. It's very much easier to not hide it, but for it to slip under the radar. So I wanted to show how prevalent these cases were. And one way to do that was to not talk about one case. And one traditional way, let's say, that a lot of programs like to show that something's prevalent is just to do the waterfall of montage of like different clips, which I do in the first episode. But I didn't want that just to be the end. I didn't want to be like, oh, here are all these different clips from all these different schools from all these different cities in the country for 10 seconds, and then we're moving to one story. I wanted to show everyone's case. And the other benefit of using multiple cases was everyone has a different theme. There wasn't like one case that perfectly shows each theme. I think the Oscar Winkles, for example, in Oregon, they had a very specific case that we wanted to deal with specifically because their community retaliation was very much more interesting than something like a Davidson with the Kims. Not to say that there wasn't retaliation with Davidson. It was just that Lake Ridge had a very specific form of retaliation. And I'm not even going to say they were like the most brutal, but it was still like pretty quick. For example, to go into context for anyone's listening or hasn't heard the episode 4, she wasn't even in high school yet. She was just trying to enter her freshman year. She just got on her dance team. And weeks before, like just a little bit before, because I think it was in the summer before her first year in high school, she went through 3 bonding events, including one which was an initiation night. And she didn't have a good time. It crossed her line. And because she complained anonymously, but the coach and the other dancers found out who it was, because she reported it, the whole school, the principal apparently allegedly told her, like, you should just leave the school. And community members were just, and I saw texts and I saw like Snapchat videos of people just like saying they hated her and like that she should just leave. And there was obviously, there used to be old reports of people like telling her to kill herself or keying her car, and just like a ton of bullying just for someone not having a good time from an initiation event. Like that was something I wanted to hit, and I don't think I could have hit it as well if I stuck with one case. Masculinity is something I couldn't hit as well if I stuck with one case. Any of these, like there's different elements where it's response. How do you respond to a case? That was probably the hardest question to answer, the most difficult question to answer, because personally, I don't think there's ever been one good response to hazing in high schools, let's say. I'll give you an example. There was one other case that we really wanted to deal with. I was starting to talk with the victim, but we just couldn't like meet up very well. There's this woman named, I'm going to leave her name out, even though her name is public, but just for now. She was on, I believe, a cheerleading team or a gymnastics team, and she was hazed. She had to do like sexual harassment hazing, not assault, but it was sexualized hazing, basically. And she and her mother complained. They went all the way to court, and they won. They passed new laws in Vermont. It was actually in Vermont too, so in the same place where Milton happened. And they passed anti-hazing laws. And then a couple decades later, same school has another hazing case on a different team though, but it still happened. So it's like, how do you say that response is successful if it still happens at the same place? Like, what is a proper response? It was a very difficult question to answer because I couldn't point at one thing and be like, oh, this is one school that did this and it worked out in the end. We were looking at this school called Brunswick, I think in Maine, and they had hazing on their football team. There was I think there were suspensions. I think there was expulsions. people got in trouble, but it was so early in the process that like I couldn't be like, oh, look at this one school and look at how they responded, and look at the restorative programs that they're doing, restorative justice programs that they're doing, and be like, that's successful, because it was just so early in the process. But I wanted to find some type of case to at least talk about response, even if it wasn't totally successful, talk about response. So we went to Jordan Prevey and Tracy Stopford because they passed a different type of bill that would focus specifically on mandatory reporters. That was just a slightly different response to how the normal response would go. Yeah, so like that, one of the benefits of just doing multiple stories is to talk about multiple different elements. Even with Bob Meeker in the last episode, I wanted to talk about closure. It was a question that I didn't have at the very beginning, but like damn near to the very beginning. As soon as I talked to the Kims, because the Kims were the first family I talked to. As soon as I talked to the Kims, as soon as I saw the pain and I heard the pain in their voice, I knew I had to ask them, like, are you sure you're going to move on? Because one thing that happened with them was they were waiting for a court case in March of 2022, I believe. Yeah, March 2022. They were waiting for this case to happen. And then it got dismissed. The whole idea of like what was going to happen, like they kept connecting, they kept linking closure to that case. They kept like, I can't move. Like people literally said, I won't be able to move on until this case happens, until that judge rules in our favor. And then it got dismissed. And even before that case got dismissed, I kept asking them, like, are you sure you want to link it? I didn't say in these exact words, but I was trying to find a way to like, how do you know you're going to move on after March? And they weren't convincing me, basically, that they would be able to. And I hope they do. And they're like really good people and I want them to. But closure became a very specific question I wanted to ask. And the only way to do that, I had a rule for my reporting, which was I didn't want to reach out to anyone whose case was over 10 years ago, over a decade ago, because no matter what, I'm going to be asking people who are hurt. No matter what, I'm going to be asking people who have suffered in some way. And I didn't want to reach out to people that happened too long ago. And I had to break that twice. One was with Eileen Stevens, because she was like the person for response for hazing for decades. And then the second person was Bob Meeker, because Bob Meeker's case was similar enough to to Rodney Kim. Not similar in how the hazing happened, not similar in how they responded, but similar in how they question moving on. And Meeker was generous enough with his time to open up that door. And it's something that he talks about all the time, luckily. And again, I couldn't be able to tell that story of closure or question, is that even possible, without talking to a Meeker if I just stuck with Davidson, or if I just stuck with Lake Ridge, or if I stuck with Mater Dei, or if I stuck with Milton or Lake Ridge. It's something that I focused more on nonlinear and thematic storytelling. I wouldn't call it anthological, but I wanted to focus on thematic storytelling over linear and true crimey, because you can sell a true crime story, but I'm not really getting to why it's happening and what it says about us as a culture, that we allowed this to happen, that we allowed this to be the status quo. So doing multiple stories and talking to multiple people shows how prevalent it is, and shows those different elements of what it looks like and why it looks like this and why it maintains despite all this. And so I just had to talk to multiple people. I just had to talk to different families, different principals, different coaches, or at least try, because not everyone wanted to talk to me. There's a lot of people that said no. So
yeah, you mentioned that, and it's great to capture the complexities of it all across the country, and in different sports and their cultures and even gender. You know, when we hear about this sort of activity on a dance team, you're thinking, really, a dance team? You know, and it goes to show that that sort of behavior can really can go anywhere, can appear.
I'll say this.
Sport.
I'll say this really quickly. It'll be one quick thing. Hazing can happen anywhere where there's a group. Which is the thing, like, again, like you had the same reaction you had is a similar reaction to what I had. I was like, a dance team, really? But it can happen anywhere you have a group. It can happen on a baseball team, a football team. It can happen on a debate team. It can happen on a JRTC. It can happen on a chess team. It can happen in a church choir. Anywhere you have a group, anywhere there's the possibility of an initiation or the possibility of entering into a body or a host, hazing can be there. Doesn't mean it will be there, but any group, again, it doesn't matter what age, any group may have hazing. So it's just how you allow people to enter into your group is something that every group has to ask for themselves. So yeah, it can happen anywhere.
So, I think as listeners, we learn so much about hazing, through your work, obviously, and you interview various researchers and experts on the topic of hazing. My question is, which individual's perspective did you find the most challenging and interesting to consider? And who taught you the most in explaining the complexities of hazing?
I want to bring up one name that didn't make it to the podcast, and I really wanted him to. It was just tough. And the response, so the 5th episode had a lot of different voices, and one of the, just logistically and editing wise, to have so many voices can sometimes feel muddled, sometimes feel like you're flooding the listener with too many people, and you're trying to like, who's that person you listen to? There was one researcher of hazing named Aldo Chimino who didn't make it. He had a very interesting take, and he has a couple of very different studies, and not every hazing expert or person that deals within the hazing sphere necessarily agrees with Aldo's thinking. Now, one thing that Aldo said, for example, he's not a supporter of hazing. He's not pro-hazing. So I wanted to preface that first. Okay. But he said trying to outlaw hazing altogether is going to lead to more violent and underground hazing. So he was comparing it to something, for example, like prohibition. When we took out all of alcohol from the country, when we outlawed alcohol from the country, what did people do? They went underground, they started drinking, they started doing speakeasies. It was hidden, people are drinking, people are probably drinking more. And the reason one of the reasons they had prohibition was because of domestic violence. And they were trying to prevent that, but it kept happening. Maybe not at the same levels, but it still kept happening. He said, if we try to outlaw hazing altogether, it's going to be the same type of thing. Which my question to him was, what do you do then? Do you do nothing? Do you just allow this to happen altogether? Like you just let it, like if you just have hands off completely, are you going to say that violent tendencies or hazing might like wither out because we're not focusing on it? And for me, he might compare it to prohibition, which I don't think is a bad comparison. I think of it more, for example, in my country, with gun violence and gun laws and gun control. Like, if we do nothing, if everyone's allowed to have anything they want, then how is that going to stop further shootings, whether it's at schools or in malls or wherever it is? Like, it's this question of like, again, and this is why I had a very hard time answering the question of response. What is the proper response? Because again, I haven't seen any form of proper response. That's why we had to go with the idea, and the right idea, of culture change. We have to change the culture, to change the thinking within this culture. And the problem is, like, how do you do that? It just takes time. So that was probably the most difficult not person. He was a very nice guy, but it was the most difficult concept to like fight with, about if we do something, is that going to only make it worse? The other, the second part of your question was who taught me the most, right? Or right. Who perspective I really aligned with most. I mean, not to take anything away from the other experts, like Dr. Susan Lipkins helped me a ton. And even though she was only in episode 2, her studies like really brought me through everything. Hank Newer didn't even make it into the series, but he was the guy that got me started with like the database and got me started with just how I think of hazing. There's other like books I read, like Arnold van Gennep, who's like from, I believe, the 1800s, who didn't talk about hazing specifically, but talked about like initiations and the idea of liminality. And he's from the 1800s, so he also had a lot of, let's just say, sexist ideas too within that. But but I was trying to like deal with like initiations, liminality. The guy I really aligned with the most, which I kept trying to put in there, and which is why he's there sporadically throughout the whole series, is Ricky Jones. because we could talk about anything. Me and Ricky talked about sports easily. We could talk about hazing easily. He was also, not only was he an expert within the world of hazing, but he's also a guy that dealt with hazing, or sorry, experienced hazing himself. He was both someone who got hazed and hazed others. And while it didn't happen within the sports world, it did happen within the other two worlds that people think about the most, which was the military. He was in the Navy, the Naval Academy, and within fraternities. He was in a black frat. He was able to talk about liminality. He was able to talk about the steps of initiation. So the step of entering into the group and trying to become this different person to be aligned with everybody else, to this point of liminality is basically just this idea of like this transition period where you lose your original like identity. So I'm Iggy Monda. I'm entering into this group. Let's say I'm trying to join a frat. Once I'm in this liminality phase, I'm not Iggy Monda anymore. I'm about to become the group. I'm about to become a brother of the fraternity. And in that liminality phase, everyone is allowed to do anything. No laws exist. You're about to become that host. And then the third step is basically you're a part of that larger Leviathan, that larger host. So like Ricky and I could talk about philosophy within the world of hazing. We could talk about his own personal experience versus my own personal experiences. I brought up like the Fight Club with him. I could bring up, and also one thing I did with him that you heard in the 6th episode is I played some tape for him. I played Rodney's tape for him because I met up with Rodney and the Kims one more time. I talked to them over the phone a couple of times. I texted them. We Zoomed for a couple of interviews, talked to their lawyer. But I didn't want to end the series without meeting up with them again and dealing with that question of closure. And Ricky is someone who's had to deal with has he moved on for years after hazing? Like he's a professor, he's a father, he's not in a frat anymore, he's not in the Navy anymore, but he still has these dreams. And he says like I moved on, and I believe him for the most part that he's moved on, but he still has these dreams. He still has these dreams of being in the line at the Naval Academy. Like being prepared to be either, what's the word, like maybe not physically abused always, but like verbally abused at least. He still has these recurring, just, I don't know, ghosts that bring him back to this point that he doesn't want to necessarily think about. And he even admittedly said, I don't know what that exactly is in my psyche, but there's something there that keeps bringing me back to that point. So I wanted to play him the tape of Rodney because Meeker and Ricky had years to consider what does it mean to move on. And for the most part, it doesn't seem like they have, but they've been able to get to a better place. They've been, like, I mean, Ricky uses the great line of the Matthew McConaughey line from Dazed and Confused, like, just keep living, which is something that Rodney said his mom basically used. So Ricky was able to talk about every single aspect, and I was able to communicate to him different stories, different cases, different philosophies, and we were just able to like have just a conversation. So that's why, I mean, if you have a lot of questions about hazing, if you're just someone that's listening or about just listening to Roughhousing or listening to this conversation right now, if you have questions, I mean, just reach out to Ricky. Ricky's like a really just a great dude. He's going to be busy with like teaching also, but he's very open to talking about any of this.
Very cool. In part 2 of the series, it's called The Line. You asked the question in the series, what if the person being hazed is kind of having fun? Is hazing a bad thing? Now, if you had the opportunity, and Susan Lipkins, she talks about how kids want to be accepted, yep, and some haze for that acceptance and that whole bad egg concept. If you had the opportunity to go on a national lecture series where you traveled across the country and you spoke and you discussed on the subject of hazing in youth sports, which of the 3 following groups would be your main target audience? And I have a follow-up questions. Would it be grade school kids, so that's kids aged 8, 9, 10, let's just say, or middle school kids and athletes and their coaches and teachers and parents? That's kids aged 11 to 14, or would it be high school students and their coaches, teachers, and parents? So that's kids aged 15 or teenagers, 15 to 18. And my follow-up question would be, how would you communicate and articulate your points to this very specific target audience? Do you want me to repeat the groups or?
No, I think I got it. I mean, I would personally stick with high school because that's where my research was, and that's where like a lot of the stories was. And also another interesting thing, I talked about how high school cases are usually, not forgotten or purposely slipped under the rug, but they're unnoticed most of the time because of like the legal age. But another thing about high school, in anyone's experience, at least my experience too, high school before college is like always the point that people point to. I mean, like, oh, that's where you remake yourself, or that's when you start becoming an adult. High school is probably the point of the first chapter and really of a coming of age story for anyone. You're going through puberty. You're meeting new people. You're in a new environment. A lot of people, not everyone goes through like junior high school with the same group from grade school, from elementary school, but usually it is. And usually you're in the same like literal local community. But high school is usually that first time you're coming of age, the first time you're trying to see who you are, identify yourself, especially as you're starting to like get bigger and just grow older and start having different tendencies because of puberty. So it's that coming of age thing has always been something that I've always loved poking at in any of my stories. But specifically, that's another reason why I wanted to focus on high school. So I'd still focus on high school. Your second part of the question was how would I relate all of this to those like high schools and everything, right? One thing is, it's very interesting. I remember there was this I was working on a story way back, and forgive me for I have a point here. I was working on a story way back about the anti-vaccine movement, and one of the people that actually had one of the most prudent points was a theater director. I saw a play about the anti-vax movement, and this theater director said, "People like fighting with stories more than facts," to paraphrase her. Now, that's very true in the general sense. You can like even within this world right now with like COVID-19, especially when it was like way more raging than it is now, you could show stats of like certain people that had vaccines that got the vaccine, they weren't dying as much, but the people that didn't have vaccines, the percentage was way higher for like deaths. You could show that to people, and then someone would be like, "No, down the street, there's a guy around the corner who got the vaccine and got polio." One story can affect everyone's perspective, everyone's mentality. You can come with the truth, you can come with facts, but that's not their truth. Now, as a journalist, I'm also telling stories. I'm not just telling facts. If I was just like one of the things we had trouble with episode 2 about like what is the line, what is hazing, can hazing ever be fun, is we had for a long time we had different sections of the history of hazing. We were trying to go through them like Plato, or like Plato's time, Socrates' time in ancient Greece, where hazing existed, or even in ancient West Africa, where they had they like different types of initiations that some people connected to hazing. And we went through, World War II, which if you look at the history of World War II and all the soldiers coming back into colleges, it explains a lot of the different types of hazing that you see now within Greek life. We tried to go through like all these different cases of history, all these different cases of deaths or violence. And it just wasn't coming through to people. Like we had like another team that would just listen to our episodes, our drafts, and we try to see like how it worked with them. And it just never really, it felt like a dissertation or an essay, a school essay, rather than or like an after school program rather than an actual story. So as a journalist, I still have to use stories to be able to relay those facts later on. So I use the stories of, the Previes and the Stopfords, the Oscar Winkles, the Kims. I would still use personal stories. I would tell their stories. And I might even tell my own personal experience. For example, like, what does it mean to cross the line? That's one of my, not my favorite, but like one of the big questions of the series that we tried to really deal with any episode. Because another thing about using multiple different cases, to answer your old question again, or your prior question again, is everyone had a different point on that line. It wasn't like everyone's line was the same. It wasn't like everyone's case looked the same. Everyone didn't have the same type of violence or the same type of like harassment, but it was still hazing and it still crossed a certain line. Yeah, with my own personal experience, there was this one kid in the fight club, the middle school fight club, for example. He got hit and he tripped and he fell and the back of his head hit a rock. Now, if something happened to him, let's say to the hospital or worse, God forbid, he could have like seen this experience. One of the questions I was trying to ask some of my friends in the past was like, was this hazing, and could it be hazing for somebody but not for somebody else? Because he could have been in this fight club or been in this fight to be quote unquote more popular or to be accepted by the larger group who was there, right? And if you got hurt, maybe the media or maybe outside people like parents or teachers, like that was hazing or that crossed the line. No matter what, it would have crossed the line if he really, really got hurt. I would relay these personal stories, like my story, the stories of the people on the podcast, the stories of people I couldn't like eventually have in the series to explain to explain that line. I think that's the main thing that really needs to get stressed to people, whether like if this would be like taught in schools or in the news. The idea of the line needs to be expressed in a way that's not so binary. And I think that's just a larger thing about the world and how people report is that everyone tries to make something so binary. Hazing doesn't look like one thing. Hazing doesn't happen in one place. Hazing doesn't happen to one person. Hazing can happen anywhere there's a group, and it can happen in a small town. It can happen in a big city. It's happened in New York City here. Like it doesn't matter. It doesn't have a demographic. And it doesn't have a specific example. It's not always what you see in Greek life. Hazing can be very specific types of initiations to get into that group. But not everyone might feel like it crosses their line. And that's the thing that really needs to get stressed is everyone. And this is something I had to deal with in my own reporting because I kept asking everybody, what is your line? What is your line? What is your line? What is your line? Because I was trying to find the X mark. For me, the obvious X mark is anything sexual assault related. Anything sexual assault related would be definitely passing like any type of line, anyone's line, obviously. But other people, like whether it's like dogpiling or jumping on someone, like people like at Davidson, like you heard Cameron at the beginning of the second episode, he got dogpiled. Like maybe not to the extent of Rodney, but he got jumped and he got hit before, but he considered it fun. For him, it wasn't crossing a line. So what does it mean to cross the line? And how do you know it can cross somebody's line is like a question that is very difficult to answer, but also something that needs to be stressed. So I think you ask that question when you're in a group, when you're on a team, before you do something to somebody, before you quote unquote haze or play around with them or roughhouse them or, whatever the word or term you want to use for that. You have to ask, can that cross that person's line? And I think that's going to be the question. That's like the main thing that might help with the conversation starter before you get to, oh, hazing's all bad, no matter what. Because I don't think all initiations are bad. I know I came out with this series, but because again, there's this long spectrum of things that happen. There was this one, I told you about this case way back when in the last interview in Ohio, where someone was accused of this coach was accused of allowing hazing to happen. And it didn't, if you look into it, I'm not going to go into details right now, but if you look into it, it doesn't look like hazing whatsoever. It doesn't even look like the word hazing. It looked like something completely different, but he was still accused of it because everyone tried to like box in this word hazing to mean a very specific thing. There's a spectrum of hazing. It can look something like what happened to Jordan Prevey. It can also look like something that happened to Rodney. It can look like something that happened to Sabrina. All those cases are very different. Everyone's line got crossed. It's just about stressing what the spectrum of hazing can be, what hazing's definition is, and also what does it mean to cross that line. I think that's like, if you're going to go like talk to schools, you're going to talk to students, especially young kids, whether it's like you were saying before, grade school, elementary school, middle school, junior high, high school, or even colleges. Like the way to get through them is probably just telling, like, rather than being like, hey, yo, you can die. Hey, yo, alcohol is going to kill you. Violence is going to kill you. Like, just, instead of like always making it so black and white, talk about the spectrum and talk about, make sure you're not crossing that line. Make sure there's no way. And that's the thing that Susan Lipkins was trying to stress was, if you talk to a lot of experts, no matter what you do, which is very possible and looks like it's true from what I've seen, it's going to snowball into something that will eventually cross somebody's line.
Right.
So again, hazing is not black and white. It's not binary. Should it be allowed to happen? I personally think no, which is probably obvious from the podcast, but I don't think all people that haze are bad. I don't think all people that get hazed are bad. And I don't think all hazing is bad, but I think it can lead to something bad. And that's the bigger thing that needs to be talked about. It can definitely snowball into something that crosses somebody's line or everyone's line, or it can convince people that this is okay. And it just leads to worse stuff. Because that's the other thing with my experience in the frat that I tried to stress in the episode 2 was that, yeah, what happened to me, I thought it was chill. I thought it was okay. I didn't think it was bad to me or to the people around me. But I eventually wanted to one up the class before me. I ended up being the pledge master. I ended up being the hazer, the perpetrator. And I wanted to one up. Who knows what happened after me? Obviously, you heard from one of my brothers, but it's something that can escalate. So it's just something that you have to just, if you are going to do it, which it's really stupid. Hazing's kind of really, just the idea of hazing is kind of stupid. But if you are going to do it, you have to continue to ask this question of, what does it look like? Why are we doing it? Is it going to cross this person line? Is it going to go too far?
Right.
And it lead to something that's too dangerous or too painful or too damaging in the end? That's really the question in the end.
It's very relevant to ask those questions. I must say, even locally here in Ottawa, I'm based in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, and we had recently there was an incident with basically a fight club. These high school students. I'll send you the article. I should have sent it before, but yeah, they were. There was an incident with a bunch of high school students, boys, teenagers, who were going to parks and essentially fighting each other. It was a fight club thing, and I'll send you the article because there's another component to it where. Anyways, I'll send it to you and you can tell me what you think. But I have a question here. I'm going to skip it for now. I'll probably get back to it afterwards. But I'm curious about part 3, the series called The Coach, which I think is a very important one because my knee-jerk reaction was, well, where's the coach? Where's the person in charge, right? That's what we usually think. There has to be someone in charge who's implementing that accountability, this, that, and the other. You interview Rob Miller, who coaches coaches on coaching and responsible coaching, etc. And there's so many great quotes in this series, I must say, overall in this podcast series. One of which I think he drops an interesting one here. I really enjoyed this one. He says, quote, "If you're all about performance and not about culture, your team is in trouble," unquote. My question for you is, what do you think about this quote, and how much responsibility should we expect from coaches when it comes to creating a positive environment for kids?
One thing I really wanted to do with this episode, and I hope got through, because it was a very different episode with the first draft, for example. I wanted to make sure, again, talking about the spectrum, talking about non-binary, I wanted to make sure that everyone didn't think, for example, Fred Riley's case was the only way coaches had to deal with these stories or deal with hazing. Like what Riley was doing, or how Riley responded to Rodney's case isn't how every coach responds. It's not the worst one I've seen, and it's not the best one I've seen. There's coaches that have dealt with it way worse than Riley, and there's coaches that have dealt with it way better than Riley. I want to talk about that just because of the fact that it depends on what the hazing case is, and it depends on the program. There's hazing in programs that are amazing. For example, the modern day case. That quote right there that you brought up with Rob Miller very much aligns with the modern day case. Number one football program in the country. They can, because of the winning ways, they can be like, oh, we're winning. We have all these amazing prospects that are going to the best Division I programs or getting drafted number 1 overall in the NFL. Why would we stop what we're doing, both on the field and in the locker room? Why would we stop that? Because it's leading to wins. Like, the performance is there. At the same time, hazing happens on bad programs too. It's not like hazing is directly correlated to performance. So, for example, Davidson, before Rodney was there, with Joanne Poe, the guy you also heard in the third episode in the second act, where he talked about Riley being in the locker room when he got kicked in the face and started like getting roughhoused and everything. Right. Joanne was somewhat of a prospect, but he was on bad teams at Davidson. Davidson wasn't winning at the time. And there's different reasons that people gave for like why they weren't winning. Maybe they weren't together. Maybe they didn't trust the coach. Maybe they just were bad players. Whatever, that doesn't matter. The point is they didn't have a winning record. The performance wasn't there, but the hazing just kept happening. So it was more like, why is that culture still there? Now, to go back to the quote, there's a lot of coaches that would be out there, a lot of cases that I looked at, they'd be like, oh, we're winning. This is also the thing that's keeping the community, whether that's the school community, whether that's the football community or whatever sport community, whether that's the actual town community, like at Lake Ridge. They'd be like, oh, this is what our identity is. Why would we move away from it? This is the status quo. This is helping us win. I'm not going to like stop it. Like the thing with Raleigh, according to some of the players, was that we're making gladiators, we're making tough players. Why would I move away from that if it's going to lead to some type of performance? In the end, that's dumb. Again, and I'm going to say it's dumb because of the fact that hazing happens on bad programs too. Hazing doesn't lead to better players or better people or better whatever. Like Ricky Jones said something to me on one of the interviews. It didn't make the series, but it was really funny. He's like, I like to think, he said, like, I like to think that I became a professor and I got my graduates, my master's and all this, not because I got hazed. I don't think I'm smart because I got hazed. Hazing just happened to me. Like people don't get hazed and suddenly become good players. They don't suddenly become good baseball players. They don't suddenly become good football players. That can mess up their psyche. And again, going back to this idea of closure, let's say in this worst case scenario, hazing actually does lead to good performance on the field. These players might not make it to the NFL, might not make it to colleges, but let's say they do all of that stuff. They still have to deal with that afterwards. They still have to deal with like trying to deal with what happened to them afterwards, whatever the hazing looked like.
Right.
Again, Ricky still has dreams. Meeker still has dreams. Meeker was affected so much that he brought a Leatherman with a knife on it to his other teammates. Like you still have these are still kids. These are people. These are kids, man. They're in high school. Like and I'm not saying that to say like, oh, when they're older, this should happen. It's just the fact that if you're a coach that cares more about your record and winning, or cares more about creating gladiators, or cares more about, I don't know, your sports success than dealing with kids and trying to help them like move on like in this world and be like proper people, like then I don't think you're in it for the right reasons. Like, I mean, there's this like line that everyone says, like you have to be a leader of men as a coach. There's the other thing, like legally, like Charles Bonner brought up, the lawyer for the attorney for the Kims. It's like there's this term called in loco parentis, and this is one of the questions. Like you said, your first reaction when hearing the first two episodes was, "Where was the coach? Where was the coach?" In loco parentis means in the place of the parent, right? You might not be the parent of the kids, and one of the things I did talk to a lot of different coaches. I wanted to bring them in as the jury of. I didn't want to only have Charles Bonner and the Kims be like, they're the arbiter and the judge for what happens. I wanted to talk to other coaches and see like, what are your thoughts about how to deal with this? A lot of the coaches said, I'm not the parent of the kid, but you still are responsible for those kids. You're still responsible for whether it's at a football camp or a baseball camp in the summer when you're dealing with them, specifically with them, or whether in the locker room or whatever the culture is there, you're still responsible if something goes wrong. And a lot of the times, these coaches are not being held responsible, or the schools in general are not being held responsible, even if the coach wants to be responsible. You might not be the parent of these kids when you're at the school, when you're coaching them, when you're teaching them. But the parents are trusting you. The families are trusting you. Not just to make them a good player. Yeah, a lot of these parents, most of these parents want you to coach them up and be a good player. Most of these parents even want you to make them tougher sometimes, whether it's football or martial arts or whatever it is, or wrestling. But you also are in charge of protecting them in case something happens. One thing, this was actually from the parents from the modern day case I worked on, that he brought this up, this point that I wanted to exemplify, but he did it better than I did. He said, if it was an injury, he brought up an example of his kid in a baseball game sliding into home plate. I think he broke his ankle or sprained his ankle or whatever. That was in a baseball play. That wasn't in a locker room from something that had nothing to do with the sport at all. Like some coaches link what happens, the hazing, the roughhousing, the whatever, the horseplay, to making them better players. But it's off the field or outside of the arena. Like this has nothing to do with the actual sport. People can accept injuries when they happen within the sport, within the ring or wherever it is,
right?
Because that's within the spirit of the game, at the very least. If you get injured out like in a locker room because you're trying to make them tougher, like is that a good enough reason? Because again, performance doesn't always. Or hazing doesn't always equal performance. So even just using that as an excuse for why this happens is already automatically wrong. Again, Riley said, or excuse me, according to some of the players, Riley said he's trying to make gladiators. But he didn't always have a winning team. He wasn't always winning. He didn't always have a winning record. Before he got to Davidson, he wasn't winning games. Michael Dansby, one of the guys you heard in the third episode too, they didn't have a winning team. It just doesn't make sense. Like it's something that you can use it as an example, but it's not always going to be an excuse. So even in that logic, it's not logical because the stats are not even there. So not only is it morally wrong, but it's just logically, according to your own stats, not working out for you.
A lot of the times when I was listening to these episodes and to the story, you think about something and then an idea comes to mind and you're trying to play like a devil's advocate. Obviously we're talking about youth sports here. We're talking about teenagers, kids, teenagers, and so on. And at times, and I found this quote to be really interesting. I'll read it once again here. Quote, "If you're all about performance and not about culture, your team is in trouble." And I think this applies to any team. If it's a sports team, if it's a team in the workplace, right? If the workplace is not positive, let's say it's toxic, but you guys are performing really well, that's problematic in the short and long term. But devil's advocate here, and let me change the formula. Please. What if we applied the concept of, because in a lot of professional and even amateur sports, and we're not talking about children in this case here, we're talking about adults, we see that there's this need to perform, right? And people will push themselves to the limits physically, mentally, emotionally. And if it's a team-based sport, obviously there's that dynamic amongst players, right? And everyone wants to keep each other, quote unquote, hungry. And I'm playing devil's advocate here, folks. This is not what I believe personally, but a lot of the content we absorb in interviews, in articles, and just the culture around some sports, it's like you got to win, right? You got to win at all costs, and you have to toughen up, and you have to be resilient, and you have to deal with the stress that comes along with that. And sometimes in a team environment, maybe a player is not stepping up. They're not giving 110%. I don't want to put Michael Jackson in this conversation, but I'm sorry, Michael Jordan.
Yeah, I was gonna follow you. I was gonna follow you all the way. I wasn't sure where it was going.
Sorry. Yeah, there's that documentary on Netflix that I'm sure you've seen. Where in practice sometimes he's really pushing his players. He wants to see them excel, and it's not just Jordan. It's for this example, we could use him, but it's on any team, even on rec teams here. Sometimes you see that sort of behavior where it's bordering on like, okay, is this bullying? Okay, is this? And what happens in the locker room when it's more than one person? It's a group. It's a team approach to kind of regulating themselves. Yeah. I guess. Pardon me for the long ramble there. I kind of want to know, in your opinion, when it comes to adults and professional athletes and high performance amateur athletes in the Olympics and so on, is hazing almost acceptable? And I mean, and let me, like, I'm not talking about where we cross that line where someone gets assaulted or viciously hurt, but like, is there, in a team-based sport, is there a need to kind of, elbow the person and say, wake the fuck up. What are you doing? This is game 7. This is it. Do you want to be a winner? You know what I'm saying? Because I think part of me at times, I was listening to this podcast and I'm like, we know it's wrong. We know it's wrong, particularly when it's for kids. But is it wrong? Is it also wrong for adults? And I say this as a sports fan, but I'm also a parent. I'm a parent. I'm a parent of a young child. And I wouldn't want any child, teenager, whatever, to be a victim of hazing. In a sporting context or bullying in any context. I think you've raised the flag on it. But the question to you is quote unquote hazing acceptable in professional high performance teams, sports teams, etc.? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can bring up a couple of different things here to answer that question. One thing, you brought up the Michael Jordan example, and I will go back to what I said before. People like using stories to instead, or people believe in stories over facts. So people don't always bring up Michael Jordan, but people will bring up like a Michael Jordan-esque, a Bob Knight-esque coach, who very successful coach, very beloved coach, who went on notorious tirades, notorious for like throwing chairs and yelling at refs and yelling at his players. There's obviously the case with Mike Rice.
Sorry, can I just quickly say there are people who are fan of that, or they're fans of that approach. Like I've seen clips of it, and I hate to say it, I'm like, man, what a great coach. He's regulated, you know what I'm saying? Like but sorry, please continue.
No, it's fine. It's just the thing is people like bringing those stories as if like, oh, this one person did it this way, so that has to be the case for everything else. And to go back to the other thing I said before, hazing doesn't equal performance. Like I've seen multiple stories. Like if you go through the database, or if you go through even outside of that, if you go through like different cases of like was it New Mexico, University of New Mexico just had a hazing scandal in their basketball team this year. They're not winning games. They're not winning the national championship. Like, it doesn't mean that you're going to win. You're not going to become Michael Jordan because you get hazed. You're not going to be this great player just because you get hazed. It doesn't make sense. You can coach in certain ways. I'll bring up another coach. Like, I'll bring up another story to fight against stories. George Karl was a coach of the year at least once. He coached a lot of great teams. He coached number 1 seed teams in the NBA. Everyone that's been coached by him, from what I've seen, from what I've heard, hates him. Like they all like Rafer Alston, who was and one legend, street ball legend, and also played in the NBA and almost won a chip with the Orlando Magic. He played for George Karl. He got drafted by the Bucks, and George Karl never played him because he didn't like his style, didn't like that he's from the streets. Buggy hated, like everyone hated his style. Everyone hated how he talked to them, but he was winning games. So like even if you're winning games, even if your coaching style or whatever form you're coming in doesn't mean you're connecting with these players, doesn't mean you're going to win, because George Karl didn't win a chip in the end. You don't have to be. Everyone likes to think that they're going to be, or they can connect stories from like a Kobe Bryant with Smush Parker or Michael Jordan with like Steve Kerr and all these things to mean like, oh, if I'm like Mike in this way, I'm going to become Mike in every other way. That's not how it is. Michael Jordan was also an amazing athlete, like an incredible person. Michael Jordan was also like just like, yeah, he had that X factor. Yes, he had that killer. Like Kobe obviously was the Mamba. And now you're also going to, because of that, you're also hearing all these like ridiculously stupid conversations about are people scared of LeBron, as if LeBron hasn't been in the finals all those years and been knocking out teams. Like LeBron plays in a different way. LeBron is a very much of a people person, according to everything I've seen or I've heard. He coaches other players or plays with other players in a different way than Michael Jordan, but he's still one of the best players of all time. Like, you can tell stories, but that doesn't mean anything. Hazing doesn't equal performance. Now, does hazing exist in the pros? Yeah, it does. It might look different. Usually it looks different. I mean, all you have to do, you don't even have to listen to me. All you have to do is watch Hard Knocks. Hard Knocks has like initiation things all the time, whether it's getting the rookies to sing for the team or do like a talent show for the team, or if it's they tie them up against the goalpost and like they pour like whatever powder and Gatorade on top of them, or they leave them there, put shaving cream or shave their heads. Like, it can look different. Like, there's a lot of players I could bring up that have hazed in the pros or whether in college. Shaq was a notorious hazer. Like, I love Shaquille O'Neal. I'm a Miami Heat fan. He helped me bring a championship, even though he's going to hate this, but like, he's never, I mean, like, if he hears this, but like Alonzo Mourning was a better center than him on the 2016. But my point is, Shaq was a notorious hazer. Shaq has this story. I forgot who told it, but Shaq, for example, I'm not sure if you want to like get graphic, but it's not violence related, but he apparently dropped a whole bucket of, bodily fluids on some of his rookies, like in the bathroom. If that happened to me, I might be fighting too. I might try to fight Shaq. I will definitely lose to Shaq, but I might fight Shaq if he did that to me. Shaq was a notorious hazer. Did that make him a better player? Like, it's Shaq also, and like to go back to your earlier point, do you need that toughness? Shaq, I'm pretty sure Shaq's father was a lieutenant or something. Like, he had that like tough father, but that doesn't necessarily equal performance. There's no one way to performance or to success. There's plenty of players in different sports, plenty of athletes from different sports that had very different parents or very different coaches. There's not one answer to how you do this. So to talk about like, does accepting abuse, whether that's hazing or any other form, does accepting abuse equal success? No, it doesn't. That doesn't mean you get success. It possibly sometimes can lead, like people will think that, like a Bruce Rowlandson in modern day might think allowing this to happen in the locker room might lead to success because I'm successful. Doesn't mean that's the reason why you're successful. So I would just counter that. That just doesn't make sense to me. It's not apples to apples for me. I've seen other players and other coaches, like Eric Spoelstra right now is having an incredible run in the NBA playoffs. He's never thrown a chair at anybody. He's talked tough to people. He's been up in people's faces, but no one's like, he's not like fighting people from what I know, at least. Like, it's just abuse doesn't mean abuse doesn't equal success. And even if abuse equals success, why is that something we should accept? That doesn't mean anything. Like, that doesn't, like, I think it's an old form of coaching or old form of playing or old form of acceptance. We're at a point in our lives or in our history where we need to start questioning some of these like old behaviors and old tendencies, because that doesn't mean, like, even if it does equal success, which it doesn't, why should it? There's different forms of success. There's different, and also my life doesn't need to be attached to sports success. I'm more than just the sport. I'm talking like for like the player and the coach right now, because I'm not in any league because I'm too short. But um, I'm more than just the athlete or more than just a coach. So I don't think you need to be abused to be successful as a person, as an athlete, or as a coach. I would just completely negate that. Like, just completely, like, that's just not how it should be.
Man, I really appreciate that answer, and you know the way you're framing it, because it's identifying all these other sort of chapters and themes that are kind of embedded in the broader, if I can use the word, narrative of it. You know, when people seem to expect, I guess, from the coach, this leadership style that's harsh and mean and tough, and equating that with you know, victory on the basketball court or at the chess meet, etc. You know, it's I think through popular culture and through what we see, we kind of see that as, and I'm generalizing here, folks, but we see that even through some of these social media, you know, this whole narrative of tough masculinity and what success is and all that, you know, tough guy talk, and even, you know what I'm saying? Like in everything from sports entertainment and how it's marketed, we kind of see that. And I really like what you're saying about, you know, different approaches and different styles of what success looks like, because I think in a way that has to be also integrated and marketed out in, you know, you don't have to be an asshole to you know what I'm saying, to kind of get over and win and so on. How much time do we have left? Because I have more questions to ask.
I got time. One quick thing I'd like to say, because I forgot to say it, is just, for example, at Lake Ridge was winning championships for the dance team. And once the accusations started coming out, they're like, why are you affecting the team? Why are you trying to attack this coach? At Davidson, people around Riley and the team were saying, like, Riley wanted to be Nick Saban. He wanted to go to college levels again. He wanted to be Bear Bryant. He wanted to be that coach. He wanted, like, to be, quote unquote, the Michael Jordan of his coaching thing. So like, even people in that situation will always point to the things that you were pointing at as a devil's advocate. They wanted to be that peak, and they're like, oh, the only way to do that peak is the way I'm coaching now, or allowing these types of like abuse to happen. That's all I wanted to say.
For sure. I want to follow up in terms of that episode, part 3, I think is a very, like, all 6 parts are great, but part 3 is a very interesting one, I think, for any coach out there, or anyone who's interested in coaching. Quick follow-up with you in regards to what Rob Miller says, in terms of, you know, he's someone who coaches the coaches, right, on coaching, responsibility, accountability, and so on. What happens in scenarios, because for some youth sports, right, these coaches are volunteers. These are ex-players who might have played at the high school level. Some might have played at the collegiate level. Some probably never actually played. They're just volunteers. They're enthusiastic, and God bless them for that, because they play an important role. And I guess quickly, if I can ask, how important is that professional development of coaches, even at the, grade school, middle school, high school level? How important is that? Because you would imagine that they would cover this topic of youth safety and anti-hazing and so on.
It's interesting. Rob Miller, the guy you just brought up, he also brought up the idea to me in our interview that most high school coaches, if you're dealing specifically with high school, most high school coaches of sports are also teachers. They're also people that are trying to teach, whether it's science or history or just gym, like PE. And that's probably the way it should be when we're dealing with like younger kids, rather than coaches that are like, oh, I'm in, like someone like a Bruce Rollinson is only a football coach, and only responsibility for the high school youth level is winning games, no matter how you win games. Sorry, can you repeat your question? Because I had a point and I just lost it for a second.
How much professional development and training should be given to coaches at the high school level?
Yeah, that's what I thought it was.
Yeah.
There's this other guy named Mitchell Lyons who is trying to pass a law in Massachusetts for how to coach and how to like do coaching properly, emotional coaching, basically. And it's a very interesting topic, because even like someone like a Susan Lipkins, she told me, she asked coaches multiple times, like, oh, how much time do you spend with coaches or with your players to talk about bullying and hazing and harassment? And they're like, oh, 30 seconds, maybe half an hour. There's a lot of schools and a lot of handbooks that have the word hazing in there and have like obligations to deal with hazing, and they have quote unquote training for how to deal with hazing within their programs or bullying or whatever it is. But it's kind of a lot of the schools and a lot of programs and a lot of states kind of deal with it as if it's like a quota rather than something that's actually important to the team or to the coach or to the players. It's more like we have to fulfill this obligation. It's kind of like the terms and agreement page when you like, let's say you download an app on a phone or whatever it is. You're like, I'm not going to read this. I'm just going to press agree at the end and just get through it because I just want to get to what I actually am here for. And that's what it seems like a lot of coaches are doing. And again, like in episode, I know we're talking about 3, but in episode 5, I brought up that how many states have hazing laws. Almost all of them have hazing laws. But again, it's more of that quota thing. It's more of just fulfilling it so we can get to the thing we actually want to be here for, which is the sport, which is the competition, which is whatever. So a lot of coaches have training and a lot of coaches have programs where they're told how to deal with hazing. And a lot of players have, like, for example, Lake Ridge. I'm pretty sure now, at the very least now, I know Oregon passed this, and I tried to like get evidence of this. And I went through the program they had to do. They had this slideshow, let's like 30 something slides, I think, of harassment. I think it only mentioned the word hazing once, but it was talking about just overall like team bonding and team, like just bullying and harassment and all that stuff. It's something that I could just click through really quickly. It's not like something like it feels more like something that is more of an obstacle to coaches and players rather than something that they're really focused on. Because even if you think about outside of the coach, if you think about the athletes, you're talking about kids. You're talking about people that just, I don't want to deal with this. I got math homework. I got practice in a second. Like I'm not going to read this. I'm just going to get through. So it's how do you communicate that? And there are now, not to say that every coach and every school is like this. There are schools that are trying to deal with, even if hazing happens, there's schools that are trying to deal with like restorative justice programs, which is like, how do you bring these kids back? How do you rehabilitate them? How do you deal with these coaches? How do we move on from this process and try to make it better that this doesn't happen again? There's that too. But there's a lot of coaches that don't really care. There's a lot of players that don't really care. And it's just, again, it's more about changing the culture of how do we make this like a priority that people need to talk about and need to deal with. There are those programs, but it's just making sure that you stress that this can happen. And maybe one way you can deal with that is fear, but I'd rather not be fear. Because like you saw Howard Langley at the top of episode 3, be like, one of the main reasons after 30 years of coaching track and football that I retired It's because I was scared. This is one part that I didn't put in there, but he said, I'm an African American man in New York City. I am scared that I'm going to be accused of anything. But when it comes to hazing, when it comes to kids doing stuff when I'm not around, I'm scared I'm going to be accused of that. So I'd rather just take a step back. And that's a fear that I didn't know really existed until he said that to me, until he like explained that to me. I'd rather coaches not have to do this because of fear. I'd rather coaches do this because they're good coaches. They're good people. They're good men and women and non-binary people that just want to explain to their students, like, don't abuse each other. Like that should just be a human thing to explain. You're a parent. Right. I assume every parent or most parents are like, don't bully the kid at school or don't like hurt each other. You have to learn ethics and morality as you grow up. It's part of the growing up process. And you hope that you don't learn that at like 25 to 30. You hope you learn that in school or as you grow up as a kid. Like if you're a kid that doesn't learn ethics and morality as a young age, you might not be able to do it later on as you're an adult. So it's something that coaches and teachers and guidance counselors and principals and parents and siblings and friends should be able to talk about, and without actually just making it an obligation and an obstacle for them. So there are programs out there. There are things, there are quotas, there are handbooks that tell people to do this. It's more about changing the culture and changing the idea that this is not an obstacle. This is not just a terms and conditions agree page. You have to make this something that's like a priority. So how do you make it a priority? I hope time passes on quickly enough that people actually care about it more. It's a tough question.
In that same episode, we look at a different solution called aiming, quote unquote, aiming for the wallet, legally speaking. What do you think of Charles Bonner's approach to bringing change and addressing the topic of hazing in youth sports by essentially, aiming for the wallet and that legal approach? In your opinion, is this the best way forward?
That's an American question, I think. Charles Bonner is like a very big time civil rights lawyer. Been doing civil rights since he was a kid. Right now he's also, I mentioned this in the episode, he's also the attorney for a lot of the Uvalde families after the school shooting there. And he's doing the same thing there, going after like gun companies as well as the school and the police. Aiming for the wallet, like I think he says it perfectly, man. It's just the only way to stress something is important to people is to aim for their pocketbooks, their wallets, their bank accounts. Because if we just say like, hey, don't do this, and they're still doing it, why would they change? Especially when like the devil's advocate before, they're like, oh no, this is how we've always done it. This is the status quo, and this is gonna make success happen.
Right.
Do I think it should be that way, that we need to get into the legalese and bank accounts to try to change everything? I don't think that's how it should be. But again, that's just the American way, it seems like. And maybe, I mean, other countries too, but at least in this context, it's just sometimes people won't change based off of what's right. Unfortunately, I wish it was that way. Charles is trying to go for their bank accounts because that's going to make them focus. And unfortunately, there's also defenses for that, like a qualified immunity, which is if any minority in this country knows that term enough, it's like hates it, because it's a big legal defense for anyone within the public sphere or the federal sphere. But I think it's a smart approach as a civil rights attorney. I'm not a legal expert, but like based off what he told me, based off what I could read, it's a smart approach. It's like, again, he's a great attorney. He did the same thing. There was a police brutality case in Syracuse. I forgot how many millions of dollars he won for the victim, but he did it. And he was trying to change the Syracuse Police Department. He won, and Syracuse is also trying to countersue because of how much money he spent while representing that case. But the reason they're upset is because he won that case and he did attack their wallets. Again, is the approach that I want it to happen? No, I don't want people to do something because they're obligated to do it, because they're scared, because they're fearful. I want them to do it because it's the right thing to do. But if that's not going to happen anytime soon, then I have no problem with Charles Bonner or any attorneys aiming for the wallet, because that's literally the way the American way right now, as it seems to be.
Right. I mean, it's an effective, I suppose, as he says in the interview, it's an effective way to change policy and protect kids in that context. In terms of, I want to move on to part 4, which is titled "The Snitch." We're introduced to Sabrina and her story, and you've mentioned her story, parts of it earlier on in this interview. Tell us her story in give us the whole story and how this quote unquote snitch, aka the victim, Sabrina, quickly is perceived as the aggressor for trying to address her hazing experience.
Sabrina Oshkar Winkles was a 14-year-old Oregon girl, and she just wanted to be on the dance team at Lake Ridge High School. She was already on the junior dance team in the middle school. And she tried out and made the dance team for our high school before she even got into her high school years. She wasn't even a freshman yet. Excuse me. She wasn't even a freshman yet. And part of becoming a dancer for Lake Ridge on the Pacer dance team was to take part in bonding events with the team, with the upperclassmen. And she took part in these bonding events. And one of those, the second event, was an initiation night, where she and the other dancers went to one of the upperclassmen's home. And then when they were there, they were just chilling. But then 2 boys came out of the bushes, I think, and screamed, "Initiation, initiation." And then the girls were brought to a room, or they were put into costumes or bikinis and then costumes. I think her costume might have been Big Bird or something like that. They were like silly costumes.
Right.
And then they were blindfolded and put into the car. Obviously, the cars couldn't fit everybody, so some of them had to be like some of them were seated, some of them were under the seats, like lying on the seats. And they were brought around town, and they were asked to do like silly stuff like jump on the car and dance on the car, or scream. Not to be like, this is just what was said, like scream like McPenis, like when they're running away, like from the McDonald's and everything. And then they were brought to Lake Ridge High School. And that's when it kept escalating. Like Sabrina's case is so interesting because it starts off really silly, and then it just keeps escalating and escalating. It never stops. And she says the same things, like it's just never ending. So it goes from there, goes to the Lake Ridge High School, like a field. They're blindfolded again. I think they get either their costumes are taken off, but either way, they get pelted with like water balloons filled with like, I don't know, syrup and feathers and such. And they get their blindfolds taken off. They see it's like some of the baseball team members are there. And then they have to wrestle with each other with the syrup and stuff on. Some of them were bruised by the balloons. And then they had to run across the field. They had to go in a river, and they were asked questions about, like, if they got the question wrong, they had to walk deeper into the river and until I think the water went up to their neck, according to some sources. And then, then they went back to the upperclassmen's home and had to dive in the pool, get a rock with their name on it, and then they were officially a part of the team. It was just all these never-ending steps just to be accepted. Some people, the interesting thing about this case was that some people thought that I talked to didn't go that far. People are like, "Oh, this is not that bad," and I'm like, first off, again, going back to everyone has a different personal line. It doesn't matter if it crossed your line, it crossed hers. That's all that matters, is that it crossed her personal line. And second, I would think wrestling for boys in, syrup, like in front of the school, in front of the boys at night, as not even a freshman in high school, like sexualizing them in a way is crossing the line anyway. But it was just weird, like how there was never ending steps. And then again, that wasn't even the last thing that they do. There was another bonding event afterwards. It wasn't initiation, because that was the initiation night, but there was 3 bonding events, 3 days total. Anyway, she has a problem with it. She talks to her technical coach and complains anonymously about it, her and her parents. And the coach talks to the head coach, talks to the school, the athletic director. According to Sabrina's father, Ray Oshkar Winkles, the athletic director sent an email that they only found out about in court later on that gave 3 steps. We can either, punish the coach, like fire the coach. We can either like suspend people, or we can do nothing. And what ended up happening was they did nothing. And the head coach was trying to find out who the snitch was, who was the anonymous complainant. Because the thing is, and this is like the main part of your question, is whenever hazing happens, whenever a community bonding event or initiation ritual or the status quo happens, if there's one person that complains against that status quo, against that community, that group's actions, usually they're seen, and Ricky Jones says this, usually they're seen as the virus. They're the ones attacking the larger body, the Leviathan, basically. Because if everyone else accepted it, whether it's accepted it deliberately or they accepted it out of fear, they accepted it. Sabrina, like others before and after her, didn't accept it, complained, and now they're seen as the problem. They're the aggressor because they're attacking not just the event, they're attacking everyone that took part in the event, everyone that accepted the event, and everyone that's connected to that event, which means the parents, the school members, the school official, the just the community, the city of Lake Ridge. Apparently, people in Portland were upset about this happening, but not the people within Lake Oswego, or at least not everyone in Lake Oswego. So Sabrina was seen as the aggressor. She started getting bullied around school. She started getting being told, like, apparently she got told to kill herself. She got told to not come back. Her principal apparently allegedly told her, you should just leave the school. And there was even one time where she was trying to go to a school dance and they asked the principal, hey, can you help out Jennifer Shealy? Can you help out and just make sure she's okay and feels comfortable there? And she says, it's not my job to be your babysitter. I think it was either babysitter or bodyguard, but I'm pretty sure the term was babysitter. So she just wasn't even protected by the school. The people that are in charge, again, going back to in loco parentis, you were asking about the coach. It's not just the coach, it's also the principal and everybody else, and the guidance counselor and the superintendent. And they all seem to be either negligent or against her and the family. There's also boosters on the team, like boosters that weren't technically part of the school, but just that gave a lot of money to the team in the school. They were going against them and saying a lot of, like, calling Thaisa, the mom, like a crazy Brazilian nut, and just all the, like, apparently she got compared to Gloria from Modern Family. It started getting like xenophobic and stuff like that. There was just a lot of, because to give you context, Sabrina is half Brazilian. So she despite her being the victim here, despite her being the one that felt like she was harassed, she was bruised, she also got anxiety from this. She had to go to the hospital once because of anxiety. She was the one that was seen as the aggressor by everyone involved. So eventually she went to court. Her and her family went to court. Took a couple of years, but they won. They proved that the school was negligent, or at least Jennifer Shealy, the principal, was negligent. Some people were exempt. And despite all that, a couple of years later, Jennifer Shealy, the person, one of the people that specifically was found negligent, specifically the courts found was negligent for what happened to Sabrina and didn't help Sabrina, she basically falls upwards. She gets the superintendent role of all schools in Lake Oswego. So even the person that the court said you're wrong just went upwards in social mobility wise. Mm-hmm. So it's just this weird case. Like, even again, the community still helped out the person that was not helping everything. So the person that was harassed just kept getting harassed, kept getting bullied her 4 years. One interesting note that we didn't get into the episode, her brother went to the same school. I think he was a year younger than her. And he was a popular kid around the school.
He was what, sorry?
He was a popular kid around the school.
Okay, wow.
He didn't deal with the same thing. He actually had a great time at Lake Ridge, apparently.
Wow.
It was a very weird dichotomy to see both of them. One completely bullied the entire time. Apparently her only friends were, according to the family, her only friends were foreign exchange students because they didn't know what happened. And they were only there for a little bit amount of time. So it was like a very lonely experience for Sabrina. Even when she won the case, all the people weren't apologizing. Apparently some dancers might have apologized her senior year. But like, it's something that they didn't want to talk about. And I reached out with all these stories. I reached out to the other side. I tried to reach out to the dancers. I tried to reach out to Jennifer Shealy. I tried to reach out to the school. I tried to reach out to the superintendent. The only people that would talk to me, besides the Oscar Winkles, was two other mothers. One, a mother that was supporting the Oscar Winkles. One mother who was a mother of one of the dancers. None of the dancers got back to me. I called a lot of numbers, emails. I called their jobs. They weren't the dancers. Out of all the stories, they were the easiest to find because they had a lot of like social media accounts. No one got back to me. It's a story that a lot of people feel like it's in the past. I get it. It's in the past. They don't want to deal with it anymore. Like they've been asked a lot of questions about this. I get it. But again, they feel like they were the ones attacked. They feel like they were the ones that, why are you coming for either my story or my identity? I didn't do anything wrong. I was just doing the thing that everyone did. Because this first year they had this hazing. The coach that Sabrina complained to, she was part of the dance team and she was hazed too and hazed others too. Or actually, I know she was at least in the initiation. So I don't remember if she hazed others, but she was at least part of that initiation process. The coach she complained to, but she felt like, oh, this went too far this time. It's a very weird story. It's not the only case. There was another case. I mentioned this very briefly in the podcast. There was one case in Colorado at Norwood High School, I think it's Norwood High School, a wrestling team, where the hazing case happened. Two wrestlers hazed one kid, sexually assaulted him, hazing. The kid that was the victim was the son of the principal. The two kids that hazed the kid were the son of the coach.
Wow.
Guess who the community and the school protected? The two kids and the coach. Right. People started wearing shirts like in protest of any punishment for the coach or those kids. So the principal of the school and his son and his family moved 200 miles away just to get away from the community retaliation.
Unbelievable.
Because that's what the status quo was. This is what was accepted as what we were doing, whether it's because of success or whether it's this is what we are, this is what our community is. You can't attack that. Even though he got sexually assaulted and was a victim, and even though he's the son of the principal who should have power, they are the ones that left, which is why I thought it was incredibly brave by Sabrina to stay at the school, because that's literally, I can't remember any other cases, probably might be a few, but Sabrina was basically the only case that really jumped out in that she stayed at the school all 4 years, despite being bullied, despite being harassed, despite being told by school officials to leave. And I can't help you. She stayed. And she said, like, yeah, I don't care. Like, I'm going to look at you in the face and be like, I belong here. You're the ones that's supposed to help me out and protect me. Why should I be the one that leaves? I thought that was noble. But yeah, that's the basic story of Sabrina. And that's a very exemplifying, situation that happens, not just in her case. I told you about the Norwood case. There's other cases. Most kids transfer out. Even Rodney and Davidson transferred out. Almost everyone transfers. And I don't blame them for transferring, because I get it. You don't want to deal with that. You want to have a high school experience. You want to have a normal experience. She wasn't even in high school yet. And she was already seen as the virus, as the one attacking the status quo. I
mean, she stood her ground, her and her family. They took it to court, and in the end, they were vindicated, of course. And you kind of wonder. I mean, I believe it was you in the narration in the episode. I think it was you. You said something about the fight to protect kids from hazing is futile. Do you remember that? What do you think about that statement? Is the fight to protect kids from hazing a futile one in terms of all the challenges that I think it was a broader question. I'm probably leaving out some of the setup there in terms of the context. But when it comes to,
I think that might have been episode 5, just in terms of response. But is it futile? Possibly. I think it's way harder to stop hazing than to allow hazing to happen. Obviously, I think hazing is going to happen for a long time. There's history of hazing that goes back thousands of years.
Right.
At least, like, if you want to connect like modern hazing, at least to like World War II. So, and I have a database that goes back to, I think, to 19. Actually, I can check right now, literally at this exact second. And the first case of hazing in high schools that I could find on a sports team, there was other hazing cases that I could find that I didn't put in because it wasn't on a sports team, was Wellesley High School in Wellesley, Massachusetts in 1906 on the football team. It's not something that, and this is also American cases. There's also cases in Canada, like you said. There's cases in the Philippines, in Australia, everywhere. Mm-hmm. Hazing has been, and initiations, I should say, have been like a very human thing. And how we allow this to happen is a question we have to deal with. Is it futile that we're ever going to stop hazing? I, as a journalist and as a New Yorker, I also put that there together. I'm a skeptic. Maybe not a pessimist, but I'm a skeptic on how we stop hazing. Maybe it's more about how we change hazing or how we allow initiations to happen. Maybe the David Berkman in episode 2, the guy who was at Indiana University in the frat, he said, like, maybe we should change the terms. Maybe we shouldn't use the word hazing. Maybe we should use the word assault or violence or sexual assault rather than hate. Maybe we should just change the different definitions because connotations matter when we have these conversations. Maybe that's what we have to do. I don't know. I don't know the exact answer because I couldn't find one specific example that worked. Again, even with Eileen Stevens, the person that was like the spearhead of the anti-hazing hazing fight. And she was dealing with a college case because her son, Chuck Stenzel, passed away from hazing in a frat. She worked for at least 2 decades, and she worked to pass all these laws. She's credited for helping pass over 30 laws, state laws. Right now, there's 46 states with hazing laws, and hazing still happening, and not in just those 4 states. It's happening everywhere all the time. Maybe there is a way to stop hazing, but I don't think the laws are going to necessarily help, at least not state laws. I know Senator Amy Klobuchar was very generous for her time to talk to me about it, and she wants to make it a federal law, along with another senator from Louisiana. But will laws actually change it? I don't know. I think it's going to be a cultural thing. I think it's going to take a lot of time if it does happen. Am I optimistic that hazing will stop? I'm more skeptical than optimistic. I do think the one positive I could find, the one thing I could really genuinely say, which I tried to say at the end of the 5th episode, was I think we live in a time where people are questioning old tendencies, but also I think we live in a time where victims aren't as stigmatized and are not happy to, but more willing to and open to talking about what happened to them rather than in the past. So like one of the questions that people always ask, especially experts say this all the time, and they won't say this definitively, but they will say right now, like Hank Newer thinks hazing's happening more so now than ever, at least violent hazing. And he says this because he's following the legal cases. He's following like there's more lawsuits now. And I'm like, and one thing that Eric Anderson and myself asked was like, is that because hazing's happening more? Or is that because people are willing to come and fight against it more? I'll give you one quick story. Bart Starr, Hall of Fame NFL player, passed away now. And I wanted to bring this in at some point in the series, but it just didn't make it. Bart Starr is a Hall of Fame NFL player. He famously got injured at the University of Alabama. And the story that came out for years, for decades, was that he got injured in training or working out. After he passed away, it turns out he got injured because of hazing. Like, there's a lot of stories that are not told, that are not talked about, that are just not brought up. And maybe that's because stigmatized. Maybe it's because they accept it. Maybe that's because they're scared. But I think the one positive I can point to and be more confident about, not will hazing ever stop, and more victims of hazing are willing to talk about it more. Another thing that we could talk about is also social media. A lot of people that are perpetrators are just filming what they're doing.
Right.
So whether that's like them snitching on themselves or whatever, it's becoming more public even then. So whether the victims are talking about it or the perpetrators are literally sending this on Snapchat around or like posting videos or whatever, or sending it to their friends, it's becoming more public and it's becoming more of a conversation. So that's what I can say more to than is stopping hazing futile. Because I don't know. I know that what we've done so far hasn't helped. I know that what we've done so far hasn't stopped it. I know that all the laws that we passed and all the mentions in the handbooks and all the modules hasn't really stopped it. Mitchell Lyons, I brought him up before, we're trying to pass the law in Massachusetts. He was actually one of the guys that was upset with me because he said, I have the solution for stopping hazing, which is like how we train coaches and everything. And I told him, I'm not saying you're wrong, but I've yet to see anything about training coaches in a certain way that is concretely or tangibly in the world actually changed anything. I think you do have to train coaches a certain way. I think you do have to talk to students and kids and players in a certain way, but I haven't seen it happen yet. So I can't say that is the definitive answer. So in the end, I haven't seen anything yet that has changed something, but I do think victims, and I do think these cases are becoming more public. I think the national or global conversation about hazing is starting to get louder. And I think that's where the positive thing comes out of. So maybe there is change on the way. I just need to see more of it.
I want to follow up with that by diving into part 5, titled "The Good Fight," which is actually quite a tough episode because we're dealing with suicide. Dr. Allen talks about dealing with hazing as a public health issue and concern. Can you explain what she means by that, and what do you think of this approach as a way forward to addressing the topic? Because we're talking about solutions here and making this a public health issue and concern. Is hazing a public health issue and concern?
Yes, I think it is a public health concern. Hazing is a public health concern. When we talk about public health, like activism, like Dr. Elizabeth Allen talks about, she talks about examples such as cigarettes and smoking or domestic violence, or even something as simple as seatbelts. Like one of the biggest examples we heard about the COVID vaccine, one of the things they always did like a allegory to was seatbelts. Like, oh, people weren't always wearing seatbelts and they fought against seatbelts. It's the same type of thing we do with vaccines. The way they got seatbelts to happen, like there was a lot of commercials or studies or just people were just having more of that conversation. Same thing with cigarettes, like cigarettes. There's a lot more commercials. It's bigger outside of America, I'll say, than in America, where like if you go to Europe, I'm not sure how it is in Canada, so you can correct me. People will literally put like all the dangers of smoking cigarettes on the box outside of America. The way you deal with, like, people know about the dangers of smoking cigarettes because of all this different types of public health activism. So the way she wants hazing to get to, like, we have a lot of commercials now in America with bullying, but we don't have that for hazing because hazing is still not that concern. And a lot of people like to combine hazing and bullying, but there's like a simple, for me, they're cousins. They're not the same thing, but they're very similar. Bullying is a group of people or a person abusing one person or a group of people to isolate them, while hazing is the exact opposite. It's a group of people or a person abusing someone to try to bring them into the group. So it's very similar, but the opposite. So people, when you try to talk about like hazing in public health activism, they're usually you'll hear like, oh, that's like bullying. It's the same thing. Like, why do we have to do something different for that? Because it's slightly different and it happens in different groups and it happens within specific like I'm trying to think, teams and whatever. Like, again, like you brought up the bad egg a while ago. Everyone and anyone can haze. And not everyone hazes, but it doesn't have to be like the bad kid in school. It doesn't have to be the bully. It can be the valedictorian. Valedictorians have hazed. It could be the captain of the team. Captains have hazed. It can be anyone on the team. Kyle Hunter was one of the leaders on the football team. He was a good player. He was a good prospect. He hazed and he got hazed. Like, it's a conversation that needs to happen. So when she brought up that we need to do more public health, like activism, it just depends on how we bring it into the media and how we bring it into schools and how we bring it to just the average person. How we talk about hazing needs to change. Whether it's like the Andrew Bernay, like psychology of how we look at certain things. We can't look at hazing as, oh, just a thing that happens. We have to have a different conversation. And according to Dr. Elizabeth Allen, she's finally starting to get, and this is like the thing that we ended the episode on, she's finally starting to get these conversations or phone calls. When she first started getting phone calls for hazing, people are asking like, oh, what is hazing? Like, how, like, what is going on? Like, why is this happening? Now she said she's getting phone calls of, how can we stop this? We know this is going on. We know this is a problem. We know this is something entrenched for years. How do we stop this? So if you just listen to Dr. Elizabeth Allen and all the ways she tried to stop it and talk about hazing and create this conversation, whether it's in Congress or anywhere else, or in hearings or wherever else, the conversation might be shifting. And that, again, to go back to your question of if it's futile or not to stop hazing, maybe it isn't, because the conversation is now shifting to how can we stop it rather than it's part of the status quo. The question is also how many people are having that conversation, though.
It's like hearing that approach of making it a public health concern, as you're talking about, in the same way that they communicated, wearing your seatbelt or I think it's very effective, and just hearing that, and especially the fact that you added that to the debate or to the conversation is an interesting one, and it's a positive one to hear. Now I think I'm almost I believe I'm over 90 minutes of our time here. I'm enjoying this conversation. I just have two more questions to ask. We're gonna
Yeah, man.
jump right into part 6, which is called "Fuck Closure," which is a very interesting one, and a very interesting part to this entire story here. We hear about the long-term effects of hazing on Rodney, Ricky Jones, and Bob Meagers. I believe I referred to Bob Meeks before, but I meant Bob Meagers. My question for you is, what does closure look like for people who have experienced hazing? And why is talking about it an important form of therapy?
I'm actually I might have an answer that might be a little bit different than what you expected. I told you this, like from the beginning, I wanted to talk about closure and what does it mean to move on because of the way that the Kims talk to me. And one thing I didn't mention before, so the father, the mother, and the son, Rodney Jr., Rodney Sr., and Mary had different ideas for moving on. They all said a different answer. One of them said, look, I want to leave Mobile. One of them said, the case is going to end it. One of them said, I can't leave Mobile, but March is going to help it. Like everyone had a different idea of closure. So that already adds to this idea of like, what does that even mean for everybody? Because this is the part where I think I messed up. Not in terms of like did something wrong, but I think the question of what it like, can you get closure or what does your closure look like? The wrong question. And I think that's what I was trying to show at the end of the 6th episode. And that's why we called it Fuck Closure with the special characters. One funny thing was that my producer, this is a really quick detour. My lead producer, Lena, she's like, oh, I want my father to listen to this, but I don't know if he's going to listen if it's called Fuck Closure because of the curse words with the special characters in there. But anyway, nice. No, I think we're at a point. There's been this conversation, not in hazing, but in just closure in general. Now, at least national conversation here, where I think attaining closure is the wrong thing. I don't even know if you can get closure from any type of thing, whether even it's like a breakup, like something as simple as a breakup. Maybe I shouldn't say simple, but like let's say you're in a relationship and you're dating someone and you break up and it was like a really big relationship or it was a really big breakup. You might not attain closure, but that might not be the thing you need. Like closure is not success. Closure, to bring up the success again, closure is not the thing you necessarily need. It's more about how are you able to keep living and how are you able to become either a different person or the person you still are. You don't need to have this conversation or you don't need to, I don't know, get something or get to a line and you pass that line and suddenly, oh, everything's good again. I'm a fully healed person. That's where I think I was trying to imply at the end, because I was trying to show my journey with asking that question with the last episode too. I kept trying to find closure. That's why I talked to Bob Meeker. That's why I talked to Ricky Jones. I was like, how did you guys get closure? They didn't get closure, but that's not what's important. The important thing is how do you keep living? And that's why when Rodney said, when I asked him twice in 2 different years, like, what's your closure look like for you? Or how are you guys going to move on? And he said, which is something that I thought was very admirable that he admitted to. Many parents and many people wouldn't admit this to most journalists or most friends or most people. He said closure is killing them. He said closure is killing the kids that hurt me and the people that hurt me. Now, obviously, no one wants anyone to die. I don't think Rodney wants to kill anyone. And that's something I wanted to make sure people understood. Rodney doesn't want to kill people, but he was trying to say that if you want me to be a fully healed person, to be this idea of like fully healed and fully getting to a point where everything's good, that closure line, then that might be it. But I don't need to get there. I don't need to be fully healed. I just need to get to a point where I can keep living with myself and I can keep being just a good person. And that's all he wants to be, is a good person. And that's all his parents want him to be, is just someone that can keep living. So the idea of closure, and if it's attainable, is not something that maybe I should have asked, and is not, maybe that's an important question. It's more about how are you able to deal with this pain and deal with the abuse and deal with growing up past that. Because if you think about Rodney again, Rodney was hazed as a freshman in spring, and he kind of missed his entire high school career. He didn't get to go to like proms. He kind of got like bullied in his next school. He did like everyone around him was like bullying him. He said like he never really got to have the normal, quote unquote, normal high school experience because of what happened to him. But he's just trying to find a way to keep moving on. He's dancing now. Like, and I know I ended with the Michael Jackson, Billie Jean dancing, and yeah, I wish guys got to see it. He could dance even with like the hurt legs. He could dance, or sorry, hurt back. But it was nice to see that moment. It was nice to see his family behind him, like dozens of people behind him, cheering him on, begging to put the Billie Jean song on and The Weeknd on. He danced to The Weeknd after that, and just seeing him dance again, and just seeing him become this different person. I know he's trying to do like Memphis juking, which is a different type of dance from Memphis. He's trying to be an entrepreneur right now. He's trying to find different ways to live rather than being the Patrick Mahomes or Tom Brady or Lamar Jackson that he said he wanted to be like previously. He wanted to be an all-star. He wanted to be in the league, but he doesn't need to be that same person. He can be a completely different person. And I think what I was tried to do too much was try to find how he can be the original person, the happy Rodney, the child innocent Rodney. He's not going to be that person anymore. He doesn't need to be that person anymore. So that's why he said, and I say now, fuck closure, because you don't necessarily need that. You just need to keep living. I hope that answers your question. But,
it does, and I must say, I think in that episode, as you know, as someone who's listened to the entire series, all 6 parts, I was happy, you know, and this is for maybe selfish reasons in terms of like as a listener, you know, you want to hear, because we hear part 1 is rough, man. You know, we can hear the pain, the trauma, and the entire ordeal and how it's impacted him, his family, obviously, you know, the community as a whole. But by part 6, we can see, you know, the other side of him, as I think his parents described, or even you described. He's got 2 parts, you know, and it's good to hear that, because I think there's more to an individual's life, and you know, than some of these. You know, we all face different hurdles, different challenges, and I'm not trying to minimize anyone's story here, but I think it's good to hear, you know, him laugh. You could see he's smiling. You could hear the smile, if you know what I'm saying, because this is the medium is audio, but you could see the happiness there. And I think as a listener who's taken on this journey here, and it's a rough podcast series. We're you know what I'm saying? Like you're telling us stories that are at times very hard to listen to and frustrating, because it's children being abused essentially, and within the context of sport. But in the end, you know, there's different outcomes, I suppose, different experiences. I have this quote here. I think it's from. Sorry, you're going to say?
No, go. No, say the quote first, and then I'll say my piece.
I think it was from Bob Megers. He says, "Life is too short to be angry." You know, in terms of holding on to the terrible traumatic experience, and how he decided to move on. And it's interesting too, because when you're speaking to Ricky Jones, and he talks about that dream of him being back in that time of his life when he was in the Navy and experiencing that you know, hazing and so on. I found it odd that he refers to it as a dream rather than a nightmare. You know what I'm saying? Like because it's definitely more of a nightmare if you listen to what he's describing. I'm not judging or anything like that. I'm just saying the choice of language there. It's a dream. Yes, it's a dream, but it's a bad dream. But
yeah.
You know, it's not.
I remember we argued about the word nightmare versus dream with Ricky, and I think we talked to him about that. And he made it explicit that he wanted to use dream. And then we even talked about it with like our fact checker. This is one of the questions that I just genuinely don't remember why he specifically said dream, but he wanted to make sure that it wasn't a nightmare. I would call it more, if you don't want to call it dream, I would call it more of a scar than anything. It's a scar that reminds him of a specific moment. I wish I could give you the real reason. I just genuinely don't remember at the moment. But the way I looked at it was like, this is going to be a scar that sometimes you have wounds that never leave you. And they might not always hurt, but they'll at least possibly bring you back to that moment. Rodney, the first time I talked to him, he said every time he smells grass, fresh grass, he remembers that moment because it brings him back to his days. Every time he does a push-up and he can hear a click in his wrist from the broken wrist, he remembers that moment. I assume when he plays football or tries, I don't know if he plays actually anymore, it probably reminds him of that moment. So there'll always be scars, whether you want to call them nightmares or dreams or whatever. Like, again, like you might call a spade and call it a nightmare with Ricky. For me, it's at the very least a scar that brings him back to that moment for sure.
Last question for you. How has the process of creating Roughhousing influenced your own perspective on youth sports?
That's funny. I actually I did an interview the other day with this reporter. I'm working on a new project, and the story I'm asking her about was about another youth athlete. I can't tell you about him right now, but it's it goes back to the conversation about just what does success mean and what should sports be for us, and what should youth sports be for us, and what should the coming of age story be for us? What does it mean to be an American that goes through like these things? How does Roughhousing make me think about youth sports right now? It makes me more, what's the word I'm looking for? I am more skeptical about what goes on in a locker room now. It's one of the things I really wanted to do. I talked to one of my head coaches from high school. I talked to my track and field coach and cross country coach. I tried to talk to my baseball coach too, but he never got back to me. And I tried to set up a real interview. We got into like an hour-long conversation, but we can never set up a real interview because of scheduling and school conflicts and stuff like that. But I remember sending him an email. He called me back like within like a couple minutes. He like immediately got into this conversation about his own fears and what he tried to do. Like the example, I might have had this in the podcast in the third episode. We talked about one of the things that he tried to do was, instead of allowing hazing to happen, he tried to do this thing where the senior players would come to his classroom, because he was also a teacher, and the freshmen would have to bring breakfast. They brought like bagels and orange juice. Like that was their way to bond, to talk to each other, to meet each other. We're all in this together, kumbaya, all this stuff. At the same time, he's a track and field coach that has to deal with more athletes than a football team, that has to deal with more athletes than a baseball team. There are a lot of athletes on the track and field team because of all the different events. Does it happen? I didn't see it. So in my high school experience, I didn't have any hazing that I can remember. I asked some of my friends too, they were on the teams. We can remember anything in that realm, but that doesn't mean my experience. Again, talking about a story versus facts. Just because I didn't have hazing in my high school experience doesn't mean there's other locker rooms or other fields or other school buses and camps during the summer or whatever doesn't have hazing. It can happen anywhere. There's a lot of questions that need to be asked. I think kids, when they go through this, have to ask themselves if it's okay, if what they're going through is okay, if this is acceptable. They might not be going through hazing, but they might be going through like bullying or harassment. They might be going through coaches who care more about their performance than anything. And coaches also have to ask like themselves, like, what can I allow kids to get through? I'll say this, because we didn't get to talk about it in the third episode, or at least in our conversation about the third episode, is not every coach is doing the wrong thing. There's hazing cases where I've seen where the coach is not even there, like in terms of not even in the same state. There was at least one coach, who was his first year of coaching, and he just took on this team, and then there was hazing culture there already, and then he was punished. Should he have been? It's a difficult question, because he wasn't there. He didn't know that it happened. So like, again, that's why I wanted to stress before that Riley's not the end all be all of all cases. I think parents, I think one of the audiences that I did not expect this to be for was parents. I think this might have been a podcast more than anybody for parents. And obviously the kids that are going through high school sports and youth sports, because you just have to ask yourself, what is the point of going through sports? Is it for the kids to have fun? Is it because you want them to be successful? Is it because you want them to be tougher? And then once you ask those questions, or maybe it's just you want them to have extracurriculars to get to college, whatever it is. But you have to ask, what is the means to get there? Do Machiavelli, do the ends just justify the means, right? It shouldn't mean that abuse is allowed to happen, to go back to what we said earlier. success shouldn't be the end all be all, and abuse shouldn't be something that leads to that success. What do you want your high school experience to be? What do you want your coming of age experience to be? How does that look like? What does that look like? And just be questioning and just be open and just talk. Meeker, one of the things Meeker said was that just talk to each other and like just be open with what you're going through, because that's just something that everyone struggles with. I struggle with talking to people about like my own personal like whatever it is, like mental injuries or whatever it is. It's something that's it's a tough conversation to have, because you don't know if friends or family or people in the industry want to have that conversation. Sometimes you feel like you're a burden for talking to them about your problems, but you need to be open to talking, and you need to be open to knowing when something is too far and what your personal line is, and be open to telling people why you're crossing that line at a certain point. I also, I do want to mention that I even though we spent most of the time talking about Meeker and Rodney in episode 6, I'm happy we got to put Tracy and Sabrina in there in the end, because everyone had their own ideas of closure. I love that Tracy, despite the terrible loss that Tracy went through and the whole family went through, they she used that experience to talk to her other son, Henry. She used that experience to have like a mental health date, to like reach in and be like, hey, no, we're going to talk no matter what, and see what's going on in your life and what's going on in my life, so that we can make sure that we're okay. Not to say that you have to, no matter what, you are obligated to use experiences for benefits, but I was just happy to see that was going on. I'm happy to see that Sabrina had a great time in college from what she told me, and she's having like a better time now. I'm happy that you can become that different person, or you can get to that next chapter. But that all starts with having that conversation in the first place. Not everyone wanted to talk to me. There's victims that said no to me, and I totally respect that. 100% respect that. There is people that were perpetrators or were just in the room that didn't want to talk to me, and I get that too. I'm one of the things as a journalist, I'm poking at scars, like you said. Like, I made Ricky think about his dreams. I made Bobby Meeker think about being hazed, getting beat, and then trying to retaliate against the people that hurt him. I talked to Rodney, and the Kims, who clearly have a lot of, things they have to deal with because of what happened to Rodney on that day. Even like one thing we didn't even talk about in the podcast, which I wish we got to, was it wasn't just the mental injuries. It wasn't just the physical injuries. There was also financial stuff that happened to the Kims because of that. Like, both the parents lost their jobs because they had to deal with the cases, like the legal case. The sister couldn't go to college right afterwards. His sister was a senior. She couldn't go to college right afterwards because they couldn't afford it. One of his younger brothers doesn't want to play football anymore. Like, there's all of these repercussions. There's these ripples. So it all starts with talking about it and getting this conversation started. You asked me, how does roughhousing make me think about youth sports today? I think we need to ask ourselves every day if we're a part of it. Because if I'm a parent eventually and I have kids that want to play youth sports, I'm going to be cautious for sure, because I cover this. I know what happens there. But I want them to play youth sports if they want to do it. I want them to be happy to play. But what's the purpose behind it? Am I going to use their life as like if they're really athletic, if they're really talented, if I have a Michael Jordan in my family, right, I'm going to be supporting him. But I hope, because I don't know, I hope I'm not a parent that's like, I don't care what abuse you go through. I don't care what happens to you. Your point is to make it to the league, or your point is to be successful in this sport. I want them, my priority should be that they're happy. That's why I said before, this might have been a podcast for parents more than anybody else. It's a sports podcast, but this might have been for those parents and those kids more than anything else. And that's why I try to talk to so many mothers and fathers for this story. So yeah, I know it's a long-winded question or a long-winded answer, but it's a hard answer or a hard question to answer, just because of, I'm going to be skeptical, and I'm still collecting cases for the database. I'm still putting new cases in because I know it's going to keep happening. It's just how we react to it and how to respond to it. I'm very eager to see what happens with the law that they're trying to pass, even though it doesn't deal with high schools. But yeah, it's just, what is our main purpose when we deal with youth sports? That's like the main question we have to do. These are kids. Let them be kids. Let them be happy. Let them enjoy life. Let them learn how to be adults. Yeah, they'll have to go through some tough stuff. Maybe some of them have to go through bullying, but we shouldn't accept that as just a fact of life. We shouldn't accept abuse as a fact of life. But people will have obstacles to deal with, and people will have problems and troubles. But it shouldn't mean that we allow certain things to happen just because of the hell of it, or because that's how we always done things. It's when it comes to youth sports, why do you want your kid to be playing that sport? And what should that kid expect when it comes to that sport? I hope in the end that kid has fun without abuse and can be a great player, but I'd rather them have fun.
I just want to thank you very much for putting this podcast together, man. I think it's I learned a lot, and it made me think a lot. Actually, I after listening to episodes, I was in my mind, thinking about this, that, and the other, and just reflecting on it changed my views and perspective about sports in general. And I think these sorts of conversations are important, and I think it's a great learning experience in listening to these stories, and it's tragic for many in the different ways. But I hope that this brings about the change that's required, but more importantly, that a conversation that needs to happen, as you just said. We need to ask ourselves those questions. So thank you very much for putting the podcast together. I enjoyed listening, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you're working on next. Obviously, it sounds like you can't talk about it.
I just promised my other producer, not to talk about it as much as I have been. But it's something I'm excited about.
All right. Well, I'll be following along, and hopefully it's as interesting and informative as this is, as I'm sure it's going to be. Thank you very much for your time. I think I've taken almost 3 hours of it. But,
all good. Thank you, man.
All right. Take care.